even tell you how many times this has happened to me. I've heard so many stories of the dead visiting the living. In many cases, these visitations are experienced as deeply comforting, an assurance of ongoing presence, a word that all will be well, permission to let go, to forgive, to go on. Indeed, my own very proper pioneer stock grandmother told me one of these stories years ago, just as I was about to leave for divinity school. It was a story she had never told anyone over the course of 20 years. It happened about a year after her then 34-year-old daughter, my aunt that I never met, had died in a car accident. And from beyond the grave, my grandmother experienced a shoulder on her hand and an experience of comfort. My grandmother, who had been devastated with grief, began thereafter to find a way back into her own life. There is a spiritual connection between those on earth and those beyond the grave. We know that instinctively. So what was originally designed as a day to honor Christian martyrs, All Saints' Day, conceived by Pope Gregory II, in popular practice, it became linked with a night, an eve, of honoring all those hallowed, which is to say blessed, souls. And then in the 10th century, November 2nd was added as an additional day of honoring not just the martyrs, but all saints who were beyond the grave. And that's called All Souls' Day. On October 31st, in 1517, Martin Luther nailed his list of concerns or protests against the established Roman Church to the doors of All Saints Church in Wittenberg. And while his primary concern was the sale of indulgences, that is the practice of purchasing forgiveness for those things which the church named as sin, his thinking about the need for reform went far further than that alone. Among other things, Luther reclaimed the notion of the priesthood of all believers, something that he discovered in his close reading of biblical texts. Priests, he believed, were not needed to give people access to God or Jesus. We each actually have the capacity to have direct access to God by ourselves. We can be priests for ourselves and for one another. You do not need a minister for your life of faith. You do not need a minister. But Luther conceived the role of clergy to be practical, not ontological. Not everyone has time to study Scripture and work through complex theology. So the idea is that a minister is hired to do the work on behalf of the whole church. And that is why in many Protestant traditions, the garb that is worn is an academic one, not a liturgical one. Furthermore, Luther opened new ways of thinking about sin and sainthood. Sin for Luther was rooted in our lack of trust in God. While we may think of those early Protestants as being pessimistic and dour, and maybe it was just that dark clothing was very popular at the time, in fact, an understanding of the universality of sin, that is simply a part of our nature, was fully met in Reformed theology by the hope, the joy make us whole and righteous and restored to oneness with God. That is a joyful thought. There is a theological debate about original sin or original blessing. Are we sinful at the core or originally blessed? I would argue that we don't need to settle this one. I have an image of black and white stripes. Is there black on white or white on black? Is the ground color, the base color, the white of sin or the black of God's grace? Are we people who are born full of blessing, good, and we become corrupted during our lives? Or are we born full of evil and only through faith and God's activity made good? Or maybe we are all sinners and saints. Not one color painted on the other, but rather a fabric woven together. And this is precisely why I decided I would wear this dress today, which is literally woven together of black and white threads. No one base color, woven together. Luther called this the simulus justus peccator, meaning we are at once sinners and justified. We are all at once good by God's design, by God's creating declaration, it is good, and we are all lacking in trust in God in ways that sometimes harm ourselves or others or our oneness with God. There are some people who still believe in heaven and hell as depicted in some of the old art, literature, and preaching. Most of us don't have those pictures anymore. So, what form of correction or payment for our wrongs will come at our death is a mystery. I like to think that God will have a way to help us grow into God's intended fullness for us, into grace, even while we are welcomed into the heavenly banquet. No matter whether you believe we are primarily good or primarily evil or some mix, what is true is that God has the capacity to create and recreate the good. And we don't have to do that. We don't have to do it alone. In fact, in Protestant theology, we cannot earn our way into God's good graces. We cannot earn our way. The good news is we can stop working so hard at being good or feeling guilty when we fail. Instead, we can trust and relax. Trust and breathe. Trust and find ourselves claimed by God. And in gratitude for all that saving activity that God is up to, we find ourselves made in God's image. Gratitude is that which then starts working its mystery and magic on us to make us worthy of the saving that God has already done. That, in a nutshell, is Protestant Reformed theology. Death loses its power then. In the mystical language of the book of Revelations, we find that death is not punishment or condemnation. Perhaps it is not even a dwelling place very far from us. It is rather a realm where those who once lived in the mix of sin and grace are now welcomed into the fullness of holiness, of sanctity, and of sainthood. So today and tonight, we remember all who are made holy by God. We hold death lightly, as it does not so much separate us from God or from others. We give thanks for those who have gone before, that they are now fully claimed by God. And on November 1st and 2nd, All Saints and All Souls Day, we have those two to remind us that we are all able in God's graces to be made whole, to be ordained as priests to one another and to ourselves, to be God's beloved children. So worry less. Trust more. God holds your life. You are a priest. We are a priesthood together. We are all saints. We are among all the saints. God is Alpha and Omega. God is making all things new. God is at our beginning. God is at our end. These words are trustworthy and true.